From this seaside villa on the edge of the French port of Lorient, Karl Dönitz directed the Battle of the Atlantic. By the summer of 1942, Dönitz commanded 330 U-boats, 5 times more than at the beginning of the war. With these, he hoped to strike a decisive blow against the convoys on which the Allied war effort depended. Fast on the surface, able to hide beneath it, the U-boat seemed an invincible enemy. This is the story of how the Allies fought back and within a year drove the U-boat from the Atlantic. After 3 years of success, the hunter became the hunted. Hitler's U-boats sank more than 130 ships in June 1942. The crews called this their happy time.
We were convinced we were fighting in the right service. We expected to have success in battle. We were young, optimistic, and we'd sworn our oath of allegiance to the fatherland and to a, well, as he was then, beloved Führer.
The U-boat was winning the Battle of the Atlantic. More than 500 Allied ships were sunk in the first half of 1942 for the loss of just 21 German U-boats. The leader of the U-boat arm judged a decisive victory in the Atlantic to be within his grasp. But Karl Dönitz's confidence was shaken that summer by a new and entirely unexpected threat. On the night of July the 13th, 1942, U-159 was making good speed home to its base on the French coast. Its crew felt safe. The dark hull of the boat was almost invisible at night.
We were sailing at full speed at night when we were suddenly caught in the glare of a searchlight. A plane was running in to attack us.
The U-boat had been detected by a Wellington from RAF Coastal Command.
It dropped 5 depth charges next to the boat, pretty close. We didn't know how it had found us. We only knew for the first time a plane had attacked us at night and caught us in the full beam of its searchlight.
The U-159 limped back into Lorient to discover that 2 other boats had been attacked that night. The mystery was, how had the Allies found them in the dark?
It was a surprise for us. The U-boats were now always being detected, and we didn't know how it was happening.
British air crews were using a new detection device, one that threatened to force the U-boat from the surface. In the first months of the war, the Admiralty had contacted a small civilian research team that was working for the RAF.
Admiral Somerville rang up one day from the Admiralty and said, "Do you think with an aeroplane you could detect a conning tower of a submarine? I'll give you a submarine in the Solent, L-27. You go and try it." So I fitted a Lockheed Hudson with early form of radar. We went out to meet our submarine. We saw it at 3.5 miles, peering into a cathode ray tube anxiously. And it was the first detection of a submarine, I think, by radar.
The radar was a crucial breakthrough. The U-boat spent more than 90% of its time on the surface. Beneath it, it was slow and blind. If it could be detected above the waves, a vital step would be taken towards victory in the Atlantic. The lessons of radar were not lost on the naval staff. By the summer of 1942, the Admiralty and the Air Ministry had opened their doors to a new type of scientist, the operational researcher. For the first time, civilians were given the freedom to assess not just the equipment needed to defeat the U-boat, but the tactics too. After 3 years of war, the number of U-boat kills from the air was still disappointingly low. It was soon clear why. Aircraft could be spotted by day many miles away, time enough for a U-boat to dive. The solution was astonishingly simple: to paint Allied planes the colour of the Atlantic sky. The scientists were also able to prove that a large number of small depth charges timed to go off close to the surface would improve the chances of a kill. Their work promised to turn the radar-guided aircraft into a formidable hunter. On December the 8th, 1942, a Liberator from the RAF's 120 Squadron set out from Iceland.
It used to take us 5 hours to get out to pick up a convoy, and sometimes they were hundreds of miles out of position. We'd pick them up on radar. A big convoy, about 50 ships, would show up enormously on the radar screen. So we used to home in on that.
Bullock and his crew picked up the ships of convoy HX-217. Within minutes, he'd made another contact.
We knew there were about 15 U-boats in the area. You'd pick up its wake, first of all, big stream behind it. There was one there about 10 miles astern. We spotted him on the surface. We felt a lot of satisfaction that we made a good attack. You don't worry about the 48 people on board the thing.
Bullock had sunk the U-611. That day he attacked and damaged another 6 U-boats. In the first 3 years of the war, aircraft had sunk just 15 U-boats. But in the 6 months from September 1942, they sank 29. Naval intelligence began to detect encouraging signs. A new reticence among U-boat crews to press home the attack when they came within range of Allied aircraft. The Allied staff effort was bearing fruit. The contrast with U-boat command in France couldn't have been more marked. In 1942, Dönitz' headquarters was based in a villa on the outskirts of Lorient, the Chateau Courneval. The U-boat ward in the Atlantic was run from 2 rooms on the ground floor and the small bunker beneath the house. Headquarters was so small, staff dubbed it the sardine tin. Dönitz relied on a corps of just 6 young staff officers.
Orders for the U-boats had to be written with stencils and water-soluble ink, so that if the U-boat was sunk, it would be impossible to find them. I would first of all hang up these stencils to dry in my little room, on a washing line over my bunk. They had to dry first of all, you know. That was a joke in itself. How primitive this whole warfare business was.
Dönitz' headquarters looked across to huge new U-boat pens. Millions of marks were spent on protecting the U-boat in port, but next to nothing on improving its fighting capability at sea. Dönitz and his staff relied entirely on Navy experts in Berlin for technical advice. Their record was poor.
The boats hardly differed from the ones that were already in service at the end of the First World War. That meant no significant improvements had been made in 20 years.
The same old U-boats were still being launched. No serious effort had been made to develop a submarine with high underwater speeds, one that would be safe from Allied air attack. But there was one stretch of ocean in which the old U-boats could still operate on the surface. Dönitz began to direct his packs into the waters south of Greenland, the air gap. Here they were beyond the range of all but a handful of aircraft. By September 1942, it was clear to Dönitz that whilst the Allies might be one step ahead in the technical race, the battle was still there to be won.
Sinkings were as high as ever, and the number of frontline U-boats was still steadily rising. But the more distant future caused me some anxiety.
Dönitz took his fears to Hitler. Hitler had a simple solution. Shoot anyone who survived a U-boat attack. Then Allied seamen would no longer want to serve. Dönitz refused to consider such a brutal step. But 2 weeks after his meeting with Hitler, an event took place which hardened Dönitz's attitude towards survivors. The liner Laconia was homebound from Cape Town with 2,700 people on board, 1,800 of them Italian prisoners of war. She was sailing alone, unprotected.
We thought we were fast enough to survive anything, so it was speed and zigzagging, you know, it's the usual thing.
On the evening of September the 12th, the Laconia was 900 miles from Freetown on the west coast of Africa. Among the passengers were Janet Walker and her 5-year-old daughter, Noreen.
I was putting my little girl to bed and it was me getting her to say her prayers. And she was sitting up in bed and I heard this bang.
People in the army said, what was that? Well, I'd already knew what that bump, I'd read that before. I didn't want to panic them all, so I said, I don't know, I might have hit something in the dark, another ship, you know.
We were sort of looking at one another, sort of what's happened like, and the second torpedo hit.
There was a lot of screaming going on. I think it was the children that were screaming in the passage. I was just stunned. I stood there because I didn't know where to go.
No one picked up the Laconia's distress signal.
This Navy boy came up and he says, come on, I'll show you where the lifeboat is. And he took my little girl and he said, follow me. So I followed him. He said, you go down first and I'll hand her down to you. When I got in the lifeboat, I looked up and he wasn't there. And I started screaming. And this Air Force man was in the lifeboat and he said, I'll go up and get her. He came back down, he says, taking her to another lifeboat. He said, don't worry, you'll see her in the morning.
The port side was coming up and you could see the rust and barnacles on the bottom. So I jumped, and that was that, really.
Hundreds of men, most of them Italian prisoners, were struggling in the sea. They were desperate for a place on a lifeboat.
There's sharks about. Screams they were, some of them, yeah. Oh, aye. In fact, one fella in the boat says, if any of them are hanging onto the side, he said, call out, I'll give you the hatchet, chop the fingers off. Well, I wasn't thinking like that. I could see Ed was like, it was a low vessel, it was a submarine really, and she had a lamp on, going like circular like that, and she was picking people up.
He drew up alongside us, and he said, the women and children must go in the submarine. And one of the men said, they are not going in a submarine. He said, don't worry, it'll be all right. So we went on the submarine.
The crew of the U-156 had heard the Italians crying out from the water. Its commander sent a message to U-boat headquarters, asking for immediate assistance. Dönitz directed 3 of his nearest boats to join the rescue operation.
They were quite concerned about me losing my wee girl. Every time they saw a lifeboat, they would call me up to the conning tower and tell me to have a look to see if she was in any of the boats. They were very good. I
said some cigarette, and this German took a cigarette out, and I gave him back to no, comrade. Give him to your mates. I thought, this is a funny German. Well, I've been brought up to believe about them.
The
U-boats had hundreds of survivors standing on their decks. They'd made Red Cross flags, and they kept sending radio messages so that everyone would know where they were. Then American planes arrived and flew over the boats. They asked their commander what they should do, and the order came back, attack.
The American aircraft knew nothing of the rescue operation, but thought it had caught the enemy on the surface. No boats were lost, but Dönitz was furious. On September the 17th, he sent a new order to his commanders. No attempt was to be made at rescuing enemy crews. No help offered. Be harsh. The war called for the destruction of men as well as ships. Above all, no commander was to risk his U-boat to help survivors. "1,600 people were lost with the Laconia."
I never gave up hope, never. Used to spend as much money in fortune tellers. Maybe they would give me some clue. They had later on, this boy was drowned trying to save a little girl. But they didn't know who the little girl was, but I presumed it was mine. And yet I still didn't believe it.
By the winter of 1942, the war was becoming more brutal elsewhere. News began to reach the U-boat bases of a terrible defeat. Not at sea, but more than 3,000 miles away on the Eastern Front. The unthinkable had happened at Stalingrad. A German army had surrendered. 90,000 men marched off into Soviet captivity. Only at sea were there still victories to report. On the day before the final surrender at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler appointed Dönitz Gross Admiral to head all operations at sea. It was a sign of the confidence he placed in him. But Dönitz's job changed little. Germany's small surface fleet had claimed less than 4% of the ships sunk. The struggle in the Atlantic had rested from the first with the U-boat. Dönitz continued personally to direct them. By now, there were 405. There was also a new man in charge of the Royal Navy's escort ships. A poacher turned gamekeeper, a former submarine commander, Admiral Max Horton. Horton was to bring a new vigour to the war against the U-boat. His captains were sent back to school to learn new group tactics for the defence of the convoys. 5,000 officers were to play what was known as the game.
Wrens would come behind the curtain and say, ship number so-and-so has been torpedoed, you see, and what action were you going to take?
What type of searches should you use in this weather? If it's really, really, really foul weather, is it worth it at all? Should any escorts go back to pick up stragglers? All these things you need to have a coordinated plan for.
Terrible criticisms. I mean, you got murder if you made a mistake. We got all the right ideas of defence, and then we got the right ideas of how to attack a U-boat.
By the spring of 1943, the Allies were beginning to make the training and the technical edge count.
A second volley of high explosives.
On April the 17th, the U-175 was detected by a US Navy cutter.
And there's the Nazi submarine, forced to the surface.
Dönitz's packs were still sinking ships, but at a price. 57 U-boats were sunk in the first 4 months of 1943. But now the Allies had access again to a vital source of intelligence. The cryptographers at Bletchley Park were able at last to read some of the messages sent by the U-boats in the key Enigma cipher, Shark.
We were well in on the shark traffic for some time. The common signal was Gustav Gelb, and that means Geleitzu gesichtet, convoy sighted. Unfortunately, the one we most often saw.
It was clear from the decrypts that Dönitz was able to maintain as many as 100 U-boats at sea every day, most of them in the air gap. That spring, a convoy would sail into this huge concentration of boats. It would prove to be one of the most decisive moments of the Battle of the Atlantic. ONS 5 set out on April the 22nd with just 6 escorts in support.
We had fog, icebergs drifting south of the cold Labrador current.
Got worse and worse, and eventually we were making only about 2 or 3 knots. And you see, we were being routed farther north all the time as they knew that U-boats were packing onto us.
Admiral Horton was notified by naval intelligence that ONS 5 was sailing into trouble, and for a time he was able to offer some air support. But by May the 4th, the convoy was on its own, and on that day, it sailed into Pax Amsel and Fink.
We received a signal, and I remember it quite well, that you were encircled by approximately 34 U-boats. You may expect attack from down moon at approximately 0230.
Dönitz sent a message to the waiting boats, stating simply, "Fight with everything you've got. Strike the enemy dead."
I was able to take up a position on the port side of the convoy.
Und als ich
And when a gap opened between the destroyers, I turned towards the convoy and fired 2 double shots.
2 Doppelschüsse gelöst.
The steamship was hit and began to sink at once on an even keel.
That night, the pack sank 7 ships.
When you had a mass attack, as you had in ONS-5, the only thing you could do was to get them under the water, and they would lose contact with the convoy, and that would be another night they would be out of action.
On the morning of May the 5th, 40 U-boats were still in pursuit. But the escorts had one hidden advantage. Some of the ships were equipped with the latest radio direction finding sets.
There was a great deal of chatter went on among the U-boats, and strangely enough, the U-boats hadn't realized that we were able to work on this chatter.
When the escorts picked up a radio signal, they went in pursuit. A log of contact was kept by the commanding officer of HMS Oribi.
There's constant enemy wireless activity. A first-class bearing at 155. We see the smoke haze from the submarine's diesel engines. The submarine dives and we have contact. We drop a 10-charge pattern.
The escort group sank a U-boat that day, but 4 ships were lost. At nightfall on the 5th, at least 15 U-boats were still in close contact with the convoy.
Ja, dann hörten wir auf den Funkfrequenzen.
We heard the radio messages from all the other U-boats. And we thought, oh God, if they all rush the convoy at once, this will end up as a night of the long knives. Suddenly, a thick pea soup appeared. I'd never seen anything like it out at sea. It was dreadful. We heard on the radio that 2 or 3 U-boats were already in danger.
At Western Approach's headquarters, the battle around the convoy was plotted through the night. Only if the escorts could find the pack and drive it from the surface would the defense succeed. Radio detection, and above all radar, would be the key to victory.
Radar contact picked up on the port bow. Closed to investigate at 14 knots. We picked the submarine up on acid.
Radar contact picked up ahead at 3,400 yards. A torpedo fired from Red 20. Turned towards it.
The pattern was dropped set at 150 feet. It was a most promising attack.
While we were doddering about in this pea souper, trying to achieve something, we were almost rammed by a destroyer. It suddenly appeared behind us, lighting up the stern of our U-boat with a big searchlight on its foremast. It thundered past our stern with about 3 meters to spare.
Five U-boats were sunk on the night of May the 5th. The operations chart at U-Boat Command told its own story. a total of 9 boats lost in the week-long battle. A small escort group equipped with radio detection and radar had beaten off the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled. Dönitz called off the rest of the pack.
That was depressing. We realized that the ONS-5 operation had pretty much failed, and that it represented a colossal setback for the U-boats.
The crews that managed to make it home in the spring of 1943 began to grumble about their U-boats. It wasn't just Allied aircraft. The escort ships were now able to detect them as soon as they approached the convoys.
We had one song which went something like this.
Gib mir doch ein neues kleines U-Boot, U-Boot, das man nicht mehr orten kann. Karl Dönitz.
Give me a little U-boat, a U-boat that can no longer be located, Karl Dönitz. That was the kind of thing. Once, when coming into port after a short trip, we were welcomed by people singing these songs.
Trockener Humor, was sie sagen.
After ONS-5, the convoy battle seemed to follow a new pattern. U-boats sunk for little or no loss. By the end of May 1943, the air gap had all but closed. The huge Allied technical and training effort had thrown the U-boat on the defensive. 40 U-boats were lost in May, 2,000 men. Among the dead was Dönitz's own son, Peter. On May 24th, Dönitz ordered all his boats to withdraw from the main North Atlantic convoy routes. It was a bitter blow.
He was really in despair. He saw how things were going. This was a very great burden for him.
As if to underscore the importance of these successes, just 6 weeks later, the Allies celebrated the news that American yards had replaced all the ships lost in almost 4 years of war.
They were building ships really very fast indeed. In fact, they sort of joke in America that they were building ships so fast that they were running out of names for the new ships. You see, that they couldn't come up with enough names.
Recently, in one 24-hour working day, 27 brand new ships slid down the waves. Nowhere else in all the world is such production possible. The goal for 1943, 23 million tons of shipping.
Dönitz called a meeting with 6 of his most senior officers. He asked them, should the campaign in the Atlantic continue? The Allies enjoyed overwhelming material and technical superiority, and it would be 2 years before a new submarine with high underwater speeds could be developed.
Everybody gave his view, and this was, even if we can no longer expect to make a decisive impact with the U-boat war, as long as there is fighting, we still have to keep up the pressure. And well, when everyone had had his say, myself last of all, Dönitz said, "Okay, you have simply confirmed what I also think."
The U-boat would fight on, but Dönitz knew well enough that the cost of continuing would be very great. That summer, the Allies mounted their Biscay campaign. U-boats were attacked as soon as they left their bases. 60 more U-boats were sunk in just 3 months. Most of the crews were lost with their boats. The few survivors that were fished out of the Atlantic by the British began to tell their interrogators of the growing sense of unease in the U-boat messes.
They knew it was their duty not to give away information and so forth, but they were perfectly happy to talk to other naval officers. They then went back to their cabins, and if they had somebody else there with them, he might well say, well, what are they asking you about, and so forth. And he'd say, well, what they really wanted to know was so-and-so, but I wasn't going to tell them. And all this was being recorded.
The picture that began to emerge from these interrogations was of a crisis in morale. Naval intelligence reported that defeatist conversation was common. The prisoners spoke of frequent fights between Nazis and anti-Nazis. Agents in the U-boat bases reported proof that some crews were damaging pieces of machinery to delay their departure on war patrol.
Denn da wurde genauso gesprochen.
We talked exactly the same way about this shitty war, if I may use that expression. We said to each other, for God's sake, it just can't go on like this. We suffer losses and don't sink a single ship. Is it worth carrying on?
So ungefähr lohnt es sich überhaupt noch rauszufahren.
Hitler believed so. In October 1943, the U-boat ace Erich Topp was invited to Führer headquarters. It was soon clear to him that Hitler remained stubbornly optimistic about the future of the U-boat war. Hopes now rested on the plans for a revolutionary new submarine.
Jedenfalls waren wir eine Gruppe von 4 oder 5 Offizieren.
We were a group of 4 or 5 submarine commanders who had been invited to lunch by Hitler.
Brachte also zum Ausdruck,
he said they were in the process of developing new batteries, which would enable a U-boat to remain underwater for days.
Zu entwickeln, die in der Lage wäre,
with these new batteries, the U-boat could at last become a true submarine.
Würde das U-Boot zu einem richtigen U-Boot werden.
In the meantime, Dönitz was forced to turn to an old device to protect his crews, the schnorkel. Through this, air was drawn down to the diesel engines. It meant the U-boat could remain hidden just beneath the surface. On the 5th of February 1944, the first U-boat to be equipped with the schnorkel left on war patrol, Hartwig Luke's U-264.
Dass man Erfolge erzielen würde.
We ceased to think we'd be successful in battle. We realized that the U-boats arriving from home, the new U-boats with young crews, nearly all of them stayed out and never came back.
Just days before, the 6 ships of the second support group had left Northern Ireland to the strains of a hunting we will go. The Allies now had enough ships to form new escort groups, dedicated to hunting and killing U-boats. The leader of the second support group was Captain Johnny Walker.
It was a hunt to him. He would sort of treat it as a sport. I mean, for instance, we sank one submarine and there was oil and debris on the surface. And he signaled to the captain of the ship which had sunk the submarine and said, come over here and look what a mess you've made.
As the second support group was setting out, a British intercept station picked up heavy signals traffic some 200 miles to the west of Ireland. A pack of U-boats seemed to be converging on convoy ON 221. The Admiralty sent Walker to intercept them. The group's hunt was filmed. Walker had developed a new tactic, the creeping attack. One ship, usually Walker's own, the Starling, held sonar contact. It then directed one or more of the group in a slow creeping attack along the U-boat's course. The rest of the group formed a ring around the target. Once a U-boat was caught in this, it was almost impossible to escape. In just 12 days, the group found and sank 5 U-boats. There were no survivors.
None of them came to the surface. So the Admiralty needed proof that a sinking had taken place. And whatever tangible things that they could get hold of were picked up and put in the boat. This was a rather gruesome thing, picking up human remains.
On February the 19th, Walker picked up another contact, the U-264.
That was really pretty terrible. During this period, 12 hours, we were submerged for 12 hours. We got around 200 depth charges. Just about everything in the U-boat was smashed. We shot out of the water like a champagne cork and found ourselves inside the circle made by Captain Walker's submarine chasers.
Captain Walker.
They were swimming towards us. Now, we had a rule that unless we discovered the number and name of the captain of the submarine, we would not pick them up. And a young boy was swimming towards us. He came alongside, near to where the scrambling net was, and I held his arm in my right hand, and another officer said, well, look, we're going to ask them for the last time. And no sort of unified number came up. And the call was, let the prisoner go. But I can still feel this young boy's arm or hand sliding through my hand. And I would say that this lad was no more than 16 years of age. And it's something which has haunted me for a very long period of time.
It was not Navy policy, but on Walker's ship, he made the rules. The crew of the U-264 was prepared to furnish him with all the details he required, including intelligence on the schnorkel. They were the only survivors from 6 U-boats sunk in 20 days.
They took me to the mess, and 3 or 4 British officers began bombarding me with questions. One of them said, that was a very, very clever fight.
It was a very, very clever fight.
That wasn't how I felt about it.
Yeah.
As we sailed in line ahead up the Mersey, I think we felt, pretty good. There must have been hundreds of Wrens and people sort of cheering us as we came in.
Waiting to greet the group was the First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a moment of triumph that seemed to symbolise the final victory in the Atlantic.
I want to say to you fellas that I feel that you've had an enormous part to play in settling the issue against the threat to dictatorship in Europe. Hip, hip, hip.
3 months later, British and American troops landed in France. The Battle of the Atlantic was virtually over. There was still rationing and food shortages, but the convoys were arriving unmolested.
On the land and the sea, let's swing out to victory over here, over there, anywhere. We can take 'em 1, 2, 3 with a riff, a break, and a flare. Trumpets blasting through the air with a rap and a tap on the drum. Yeah, man.
The U-boat menace has for the time being been practically effaced. There was a recent month in which up till the last day they did not sink a single ship.
Britain's ability to fight, Churchill wrote, to keep itself alive, depended on the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet it was difficult to cheer the final victory. More than half the ships sunk in the Atlantic had flown the red ensign, and 50,000 British seamen died protecting the lifeline. Dönitz's fleet of new submarines never sailed against the convoys. The old boats fought on to the end. 650 were lost. With them, 30,000 U-boat men.
I could tell you I wept. All my comrades who I'd spent all those months with had perished.
We'd been trained to do our duty to the very end. That's why we still put to sea.
I don't think that many people thought of us, quite frankly, because we were an unseen war. You didn't see the sunken ships or the survivors who never made it.
But it was our job. We knew we were going out, you might come back. You never dwelt on us.
This nation owes those people a great deal. If the North Atlantic convoy route had failed, all else would have failed.